Hi everybody, we're starting a new unit on metaphysics, and I just want to talk a little bit about what metaphysics is and how it applies to philosophy as a whole and some issues regarding the rest of the course. Metaphysics seeks to answer questions about things like, it says here, the fundamental nature of being. This sort of thing, what is there, what is it like, are broadly encapsulated by the idea of metaphysics. But it's a big umbrella of philosophy. I'll show you in a second how the other stuff fits in, but it includes questions about how do we know about things like the reality of objects, are our senses tricking us, how can we make judgments about space and time, and cosmology. Cosmology refers to the underlying structures and formation of the universe. Also, metaphysics looks at the idea of cause and effect, and do we truly have free will? But I think you could sum up metaphysics, or at least in my opinion, one of the best metaphysical questions is this. Why is there something instead of nothing? Okay, I mentioned that metaphysics is a big branch of philosophy. Now, before I get going on this chart, I want to say that philosophy, as you know, is about argument. It's about debate to a certain extent. And I guess it's not surprising that these charts and the exact nature of these charts have variations in them. I think this one's pretty good, although there are things about it that don't exactly fit the course that we're doing. For example, axiology is a term that we're not going to use very much, but it refers to the idea, that part of philosophy that refers to value. So ethics, for example, and aesthetics, which is the study of beauty. We might look at those things, but we're not going to talk so much about axiology as an umbrella. But you see here epistemology, metaphysics, the history of philosophy, and logic as being sort of the grand scheme of philosophy. And we're talking about specifically metaphysics right now, philosophy of the mind, philosophy of religion, is there a God, philosophies of universals we've talked about. Ontology is a major branch of metaphysics. I'll come back to that in a second. And then, of course, causality, cause and effect, I mentioned earlier. Ontology discusses, as it says here, the idea of being versus knowing. And it is, how can I say, it has a lot to do with this idea of dualism. The difference between are you your body? Are there external things to your body? It also has to do with the idea of conception and the mind. I want to talk a little bit about two famous philosophers and their approach to ontology. The first is Anselm of Bec, who was a medieval philosopher in the, actually, as you can see, he was a member of the clergy. He worked in the monastery at Bec, hence his name, Anselm of Bec, around the 11th century, mid-11th century. At any rate, he presented a thing called the ontological argument, which was supposed to prove the existence of God. Now, you're going to have to bear with me for a second while I go through the stages of it. Essentially, it goes like this. And I'll put this up so that you can see it. It says, it's a conceptual truth, or true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. That is, the greatest possible thing that can be imagined. So again, it's true that God is the greatest thing that can be imagined. We can't imagine a being that's greater than God. And remember, this is in the medieval mind. All-knowing, all-seeing, omniscient, all-powerful. God exists as an idea in the mind. So for a medieval member of the clergy, when they talked about God, they all understood, they had a shared understanding, most people would, of what God was. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. So what this is saying is, it's better to be a creature that exists in the mind and in reality than just a creature that exists in the mind. So far so good. Let me go over this again very briefly. God is the greatest thing that we can imagine. God exists in the mind. It's greater to be something that exists in the mind and in reality. So far so good. This is the kicker here. Therefore, or thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, that is, a greatest possible being that does exist. So if God exists only in the mind, then it's possible to have something greater than God. But you can't have something greater than God, according to this logic. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, because as I said earlier, all-knowing, all-seeing, omniscient, all-powerful. For it's a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being that is greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Therefore, God must exist, because he must exist. If he's the greatest thing, he must exist both in the mind and in reality. Interesting argument. It rests on a type of knowledge called a priori knowledge. That is, knowledge or reasoning that you have to accept before you can follow the rest of the argument. I don't want to go on too long about this. You will run into it, but I want to say that there are people that have reacted against it. And one of the first ways that philosophers reacted against it was to say, well, if he exists in the mind, if we can conceive of his existence, then we can also conceive of his non-existence. That's Anselm's ontological argument. You see it referred to a lot in the history of philosophy. Somebody that really enjoyed that argument was René Descartes. René Descartes took that ball and ran with it, if you like, and he developed an idea or writing around the idea of dualism. And dualism talks about the difference between the mind and the body. So are you your body, or are you greater than that? It's an interesting argument. It's easy to answer that quickly, but think about it for a moment. If you were in a coma, are you still you? Or if there was some mad scientist that began to cut pieces off of you, at what point would you no longer be you? But I digress. Dualism is kind of an important idea in philosophy because it talks about the difference between objective and sort of formal or spiritual reality. So René Descartes said that there were two types of things. There was a spiritual reality which consisted of God, so he accepted the existence of God, and the human mind, and everything else was purely physical. So that's easy enough, I guess, but it creates two really important ideas moving forward in the history of thought. And those are empiricism, which you know from studying science, which is learning from direct observation, going back to Aristotle, and rationalism. Rationalism, that is sort of logical constructs created in the mind that seek to explain reality. René Descartes is famous for, well, not only his dualism philosophy, but his cogito, which is in his writing to sort of prove his existence. He said, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am, which means that the ability to think, the ability to have thought, to reason, proves the existence of the individual.